I bought my first house in early October. It wasn't big, just a small one-story ranch with an unfinished basement that the previous owner had used for storage. The neighborhood was quiet, and after years of renting apartments, finally owning a place felt like a fresh start. The basement wasn't somewhere I spent much time. There were concrete floors, exposed pipes, an old furnace, a water heater, and shelves lined with boxes I'd never unpacked. The only reason I ever went down there was to store things or reach the main water shutoff valve. I barely thought about it until the water disappeared. The first time it happened, I woke up on a Saturday morning and turned on the shower. Nothing came out. I checked the bathroom sink, then the kitchen faucet. Every tap in the house was dry. I assumed the city had shut the water off for maintenance, but when I looked outside, my neighbor was washing his truck with a garden hose. The problem was only my house. I grabbed a flashlight and walked downstairs. The basement was cold enough that I could see my breath. The beam landed on the shutoff valve. It had been turned completely closed. That confused me because the valve was stiff. It took both hands to reopen it, and as soon as I did, I heard water rushing back through the pipes. Everything worked again. I figured I'd bumped it while moving boxes. It didn't make much sense, but I couldn't think of another explanation. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time it was close to 11 at night. The kitchen faucet suddenly sputtered and stopped while I was washing dishes. I went downstairs. The valve was closed again. I reopened it. Problem solved. Standing there, I stared at the handle for almost a minute. I tried pushing against it with my shoulder. It didn't budge. There was no way it could rotate on its own. For the next few days, I paid closer attention whenever I went into the basement. Nothing seemed unusual. Then, 3 weeks later, the water stopped for a third time. That was when I bought a roll of blue painter's tape. I wrapped a strip around the valve handle and the pipe so the handle couldn't turn without tearing the tape. Before leaving the basement, I even took a picture of it with my phone. It seemed like a ridiculous precaution. 3 nights passed. Then, just before midnight on Friday, I turned on the kitchen faucet. Nothing. I already knew what I'd find. When I reached the basement, the valve had been turned off again, but the tape wasn't broken. It wasn't hanging loose. It wasn't anywhere. Someone had peeled it off cleanly, closed the valve, and taken the tape with them. I searched the floor, behind shelves, inside empty boxes. Nothing. I stood there with the flashlight in one hand, trying to come up with a reasonable explanation. I couldn't. That night I locked every door twice. The following morning I checked every window. Nothing had been forced open. Nothing was missing. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Over the next month the pattern continued. Always after dark. Always without warning. The water would stop. I refused to go downstairs until daylight. Every morning the valve would already be open again. Whoever had turned it off was restoring the water before sunrise. That bothered me more than if they'd simply left it closed. It felt deliberate, like they wanted me to know someone had been there. I started keeping bottled water in the kitchen. Friends joked that I looked like I was preparing for a storm. I laughed with them. I never told anyone the real reason. Even saying it out loud sounded ridiculous. One Friday night I was watching television when I heard a faint metallic sound beneath the floor. It wasn't loud, just a slow grinding noise. Metal against metal. I muted the television. The sound came again. Then I realized what I was hearing. Someone was turning the shutoff valve. At that exact moment. A second later, the kitchen faucet behind me coughed twice before falling silent. My heart started pounding. Whoever had closed the valve was still downstairs. I didn't move. The house became completely silent. Then I heard one footstep. Concrete has a different sound than wood. You don't mistake it once you've heard it enough. Another step. Slow, careful, then nothing. I sat on the couch for nearly 20 minutes, staring at the hallway that led to the basement door. I kept expecting the door to open. It never did. Eventually, I backed toward the front door without turning my back on the hallway. I grabbed my keys, walked outside, locked the house, then drove to a motel across town. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing in my basement, listening for me to come downstairs. The next morning I returned just after sunrise. The front door was still locked. Nothing looked disturbed. Inside the house, everything appeared normal, except for one thing. The kitchen faucet was running. Not fully, just a thin stream of water trickling into the sink. I knew I hadn't left it that way. Someone had restored the water, then turned on the faucet before leaving. For the first time since moving in, I felt certain that whoever had been downstairs had also walked through the rest of my house. I packed almost everything I owned that weekend. By Sunday afternoon, the truck was nearly full. Only a few boxes remained in the basement. I stood in the kitchen staring at the basement door. Eventually, I decided nothing down there was worth retrieving. I left the boxes behind. As I carried the final load outside, I glanced toward the small basement window beside the driveway. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual. Then my eyes dropped lower. A pair of dusty work boots stood just inside the basement, perfectly still. The window was too high to see above someone's knees. All I could see were the boots. They didn't move. I waited. Nothing. No shifting weight. No footsteps. Just silence. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The toes of the boots weren't pointed toward the window. They were pointed toward the basement stairs. Whoever was standing there wasn't watching me leave. They were facing the staircase, as if they had been waiting for someone to come down. I got into my truck without taking my eyes off that window. The boots never moved. I drove away and never returned. The house sold a few months later. I never told the buyers why I was leaving. Every now and then I still think about that basement. Not because I wonder who kept shutting off my water, and not because I wonder how they got inside. The question that still keeps me awake is much simpler. How many nights did someone stand quietly at the bottom of those stairs, waiting for me to decide the water was important enough to come downstairs? For weeks, someone had been quietly closing my basement door. Not every night, not every time I went downstairs, just often enough that I kept convincing myself it was an old house settling, until the night I heard it click shut behind me, and a second later, someone took a slow step across my kitchen upstairs. That's when I realized the door wasn't closing by itself. Someone had been waiting for me to reach the bottom of the stairs before quietly pulling it shut. I never closed the basement door. There wasn't any reason to. I lived alone in a small house with an unfinished basement, and I always left the door wide open whenever I went downstairs. It kept the air moving and stopped the basement from smelling damp. Whether I was grabbing a tool, changing the furnace filter, or switching over a load of laundry, the door always stayed open. It became such a habit that I never even thought about it until the first time it closed. It happened on a Saturday afternoon while I was carrying a box of Christmas decorations downstairs. I left the basement door wide open like I always did. I reached the bottom of the stairs, walked across the concrete floor, and heard a quiet click behind me. I turned around. The door was shut. I walked back upstairs, opened it again, and laughed. The house was over 40 years old. Doors shifted, floors settled. I didn't think about it again. A few days later, I went downstairs to replace the furnace filter. The same thing happened. Click. The door had closed again. This time I paid attention. There weren't any windows open, no air conditioning running, no draft strong enough to move a heavy wooden door. I opened it halfway and let go. It stayed exactly where I left it. I opened it all the way. Still nothing. The door wouldn't move unless someone actually pulled it. For the next couple of weeks, it happened only once. Then not again for several days. It was just frequent enough to make me notice, but not frequent enough to convince myself something was wrong. Eventually, I started testing it. One evening, I opened the basement door, walked halfway down the stairs, then stopped. Nothing. I walked back upstairs. The door remained open. I tried again the next day. Same result. I actually laughed at myself. Maybe I was imagining the whole thing. The following Friday night, I carried a basket of laundry downstairs. As I reached the washing machine, click, the door closed again. This time I didn't turn around. I don't know why. Something about the sound felt different. Not like a door drifting shut, like someone had quietly pulled it closed while trying not to make any noise. I stood completely still. The basement was silent. Then, I heard a single footstep. Not downstairs, upstairs, directly above me. Someone was walking across my kitchen. The step was slow, careful, then another. The footsteps crossed the floor above my head before stopping completely. Every hair on my arm stood up. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just waited. After nearly a minute, I ran. I sprinted up the stairs, shoved the basement door open, grabbed my keys from the kitchen counter, and ran outside. I drove to a hotel 20 minutes away and barely slept. The next morning I returned in daylight. The front door was still locked. Nothing inside looked disturbed. Every window was secure. I searched every room. Nothing. The house looked exactly the way I'd left it. For the next week I avoided the basement completely. Laundry piled up. Tools stayed downstairs. If I needed something, I found another way. Eventually I convinced myself I'd overreacted. Fear has a way of making ordinary sounds seem worse than they really are. One evening the power went out across the neighborhood. After about 15 minutes, every house around me lit back up. Mine stayed dark. The breaker panel was in the basement. I stood in the hallway staring at the basement door for almost 5 minutes. Finally, I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy rubber doorstop. I opened the basement door, wedged it firmly against the frame, and started downstairs. The flashlight beam bounced across the concrete walls. Everything looked normal. The breaker hadn't tripped. As I reached toward the panel, I heard something scrape across the hardwood floor upstairs. A long, slow, dragging sound. Then, silence. I turned toward the stairs. The basement door was closed. The rubber wedge was gone. I ran. When I reached the top, I pulled the door open so hard it slammed against the hallway wall. The doorstop was lying several feet away on the floor. It hadn't slipped. It had been removed. I grabbed my keys and left without even locking the house. The next morning I called my older brother. I told him I wanted help moving. I didn't tell him why. He came over that afternoon with his pickup truck. The house seemed perfectly normal. Sunlight poured through every window. He walked downstairs first. "Nothing down here," he called. I followed him. Everything looked exactly as I remembered it. Concrete floor, storage shelves, water heater, nothing unusual. We carried boxes upstairs for nearly an hour. Neither of us spoke much. We only had one load left. As my brother carried a toolbox outside, I stayed in the hallway gathering a few loose items. That's when he stopped. He looked toward the basement. "I thought you said you always leave that door open." "I do." It wasn't open a second ago. I looked. The basement door was standing halfway closed. I was certain it had been wide open only moments earlier. Neither of us had gone near it. Without saying a word, I walked over and pushed it open again. The basement was empty. My brother shrugged. Old house. Maybe. But neither of us believed it. We loaded the final boxes into the truck. Before leaving, I walked back to lock the front door one last time. As I reached the porch, I looked through the front window. The hallway was visible from where I stood. So was the basement door. It was moving, not fast, not swinging, just slowly, steadily, closing. There wasn't enough force for it to slam. It simply continued inch by inch until the latch caught with a quiet click. I stood there for several seconds waiting for it to open again. It never did. I locked the front door, climbed into my truck and drove away. I sold the house a few months later. People occasionally ask why I moved so soon after buying my first home. I usually tell them the commute to work was too long. That's easier than telling the truth. Because what still bothers me isn't that the basement door kept closing. It's what I heard the night I stood at the bottom of those stairs. Those footsteps weren't coming toward the basement. They were walking away from it, which means whoever had quietly pulled that door shut behind me had already left the hallway before I ran upstairs. And if I'd turned around the moment I heard that first click, there's a good chance I would have seen exactly who had been standing on the other side of the door. I found out someone had been changing my furnace filter. Not stealing anything, not breaking anything, just quietly replacing the filter in my basement. At first I thought I'd forgotten changing it myself. Then I wrote my initials across the next one. 5 days later, it was gone. replaced with another brand new filter. That's when I realized someone had been inside my house long enough to know exactly when I'd been downstairs, and they were making sure I never breathed the same air they did. I never paid much attention to the furnace. It sat in the far corner of my unfinished basement beside the water heater, surrounded by exposed pipes and old concrete walls. Every few months I'd walk downstairs, slide out the old air filter, push in a new one, and forget about it until the next season. It was one of those chores you do without thinking. The first time something felt strange, I assumed I had simply forgotten. I bought a new furnace filter on a Saturday morning. When I opened the access panel, the filter already looked almost brand new, cleaner than it should have. For a second I wondered if I'd changed it recently and forgotten. I shrugged, installed the new one anyway, and before sliding it into place I wrote the date across the cardboard edge with a black marker. 3 months from now, I'd know whether it was the same one. I closed the panel and went back upstairs. 3 weeks later, I needed a wrench from the basement. As I walked past the furnace, I noticed the access panel wasn't completely closed. It wasn't hanging open, just barely cracked. Enough to notice. I frowned. I was certain I'd shut it properly. Out of curiosity, I opened the panel and pulled out the filter. The date I'd written was gone. The filter inside looked new. It was the same brand, the same size, but it wasn't mine. I stood there staring at it for almost a minute. Eventually I convinced myself I'd imagined writing on it. Maybe I'd planned to mark it and forgot. Maybe I was mixing it up with another project. It seemed like the only reasonable explanation. The following afternoon I bought another filter. This time I wasn't taking chances. Before installing it, I wrote my initials on both sides with a permanent marker. Then I took a picture with my phone while holding it beside the open furnace. The photo clearly showed my initials before I slid it into place. 5 days later, the basement smelled different. Not bad, just cleaner, almost like fresh air after rain. I walked downstairs to investigate. The furnace panel was cracked open again. A knot formed in my stomach. I reached inside and slowly pulled out the filter. It wasn't mine. The initials were gone. Someone had replaced it. Again, I searched around the furnace expecting to find the original nearby. Nothing. No discarded filter. No cardboard. Nothing. I carried the replacement upstairs and set it on my kitchen table. For the rest of the evening I kept looking at it. Why would someone break into a house just to replace an air filter? It made no sense. I changed every lock the following weekend, installed motion lights outside, checked every basement window. Everything was secure. Nothing explained how someone could get inside without leaving a trace. After that I stopped going into the basement unless I absolutely had to. Laundry waited. Storage boxes stayed where they were. If I needed a tool, I borrowed one from my neighbor. Nearly 2 weeks passed without another incident. I started believing it was over. Then, just after midnight on a Thursday, the power went out. The entire neighborhood went dark. I looked outside. Every house on the street was black. I waited. About 10 minutes later, lights came back on across the neighborhood. Mine didn't. The electrical panel was in the basement. I stood at the top of the stairs with a flashlight in my hand, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Finally, I started down. The beam of light swept across the concrete floor. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed the furnace. The access panel was already open. Not wide, just enough to leave a narrow black gap. I didn't remember leaving it like that. I took another step. The basement was completely silent. Then I heard it. A slow inhale. Not mechanical. Not the furnace. Someone breathing. Close enough that I instinctively stopped moving. The breathing stopped too. Neither of us made another sound. I slowly backed up 1 step, then another, never taking my eyes off the furnace. When I reached the stairs, I turned, ran upstairs, grabbed my keys and left through the front door. I didn't stop until I reached a motel nearly half an hour away. The next morning I called a friend and asked if he could help me move. I didn't tell him why. I just said I wanted out as quickly as possible. We spent the weekend emptying the house. Neither of us went anywhere near the furnace. We stayed on the opposite side of the basement, loaded boxes, and left. By Sunday evening, every room was empty. I locked the front door for the last time and never went back. The house sold a few months later. Life gradually returned to normal. I stopped thinking about the basement, stopped thinking about the furnace, stopped wondering who had been replacing those filters. Almost a year later, I was cleaning old photos from my phone. Most were pictures of furniture I'd sold or receipts I'd forgotten to delete. Then I found the picture I'd taken of the signed furnace filter. I smiled for a second, remembering how paranoid I'd become. I almost deleted it. Instead, I zoomed in to read the date one last time. That's when I noticed something I had completely missed. Behind the furnace, where the flashlight hadn't fully reached, there was a narrow strip of darkness between the wall and the metal ductwork. At first it looked like nothing, just shadow. Then I zoomed in again. 2 fingers were wrapped around the edge of the wall. They weren't reaching toward me. They weren't moving. They were simply holding on. Whoever they belonged to was standing perfectly still behind the furnace while I took that picture, watching me, close enough to see me write my initials across the filter, close enough to wait until I walked upstairs before replacing it. I stared at the image for nearly an hour. The more I looked, the more certain I became that those fingers weren't part of the furnace or a pipe. They were human. Eventually I deleted the photo, not because I wanted to forget it, because I realized I couldn't stop looking at it. People sometimes ask why I sold that house less than a year after buying it. I usually tell them it needed more repairs than I expected. That's easier than explaining the truth, because I don't know who kept changing my furnace filters. I don't know how they got inside, and I don't know how long they had been hiding behind that furnace. But every time I replace the filter in my current house, I still write my initials on the cardboard. Not to remind myself when it needs changing, just to make sure no one else changes it first.